Welcome to the Natural Dog Conference. I'm Caroline, one of the organisers, and I'm here now talking to Dr. Sue Armstrong, who's from Balanced Being Veterinary Care up in Wetherby. And Sue's one of our speakers this weekend on the Saturday. Sue, tell us a little bit about what you're going to tell all our lovely dog owners today.
I'm going to talk about autoimmune disease, which is one of my absolute passions at the moment. I've been working in veterinary medicine for a lot of years now and have spent a lot of time actually doing work on cancer. And through that work, my eyes have been opened to the serious problem that we've now got with autoimmune disease in our animals and people.
And is there a link between the autoimmune disease and the rates of cancer going up, perhaps in different breeds?
There certainly is. I mean, it's interesting that you say certain breeds because there is susceptibility in certain breeds, such as the golden retrievers and plenty of others. But also it's a growing problem that I don't think many people are really aware of.
And in essence, for those that may not know what autoimmune disease is, how would you sum it up in a sentence or so? How would they know, for instance, if their dog was suffering from this?
It's a really hard thing to know because it can look like just about anything, which makes it very, very difficult and very easily missed.
Okay.
But in a sentence, what it is the immune system turns itself on the body and starts attacking self. So instead of it protecting us, it's attacking us.
And what are some of the reasons why this might happen within the dog's body?
There are many, many triggers, and I think it's about knowing what the triggers are that's the most important thing, and it's the message of today's talk, because it's recognising things like certain drugs, vaccines, foods. So many things can trigger the body into making mistakes.
Okay, because as I understood it, the majority of the immune system itself, short of some of the stem cells coming from the bone marrow, the majority of them live in the gut lining. So I'm presuming then that diet would have an influential aspect on this autoimmune condition.
Yeah, about 70% of the body's immune system is centred on the gut, and it's one of the first places that the body meets invaders, if you like, foreign substances. So the gut's incredibly important, and so diet per se is also very, very important.
Okay, and what would be, and as part of the talk today, are you going to be giving any kind of recommendations around things that people should try and do, actions they could take to avoid autoimmune disease, and also things they may want to miss out from their dog's environment and lifestyle?
Well, I'm going to talk about the triggers. We've got a very short time today because it's a packed conference, but there will be some guidelines, and we'll give people some just things to think about, and then they can visit some of the stands as well, because there will be a lot of information for them about how to feed well.
Okay, and if people at home wonder if perhaps their dog could be suffering from this, what would they do? Is this something that traditional vets are noticing, or is it just vets like yourself at the moment, or? Certainly
vets understand and note and do know about autoimmune disease, but at the end stage, so they recognise the disease once it's formed.
Right.
The big message I want to get out is to try and actually prevent it from happening in the first place.
Okay.
Because there's so many things we're missing, so many little flag-ups that we're missing that actually could stop so many animals going forward to having it.
Yeah, definitely. And that's what we're going to get
to
here today.
This is the crux of it.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. And hopefully another year, if you can come back for another year. Yeah.
Hope so.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thanks for talking to us.
And first of all, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this talk, which are Natural Instinct, the company that is being represented over there, so please visit the stand. It's a raw food feeding company, and I do have to declare an interest. I am their veterinary consultant, been with the company for years, virtually since its inception, and needless to say, seeing as I'm involved in it, I totally and utterly believe in that product. Otherwise it would be a little bit strange. So, I have my practice in Wetherby in Yorkshire. I've been a vet for over 30 years for my sins. And veterinary medicine has changed such a lot since I started out my career. And the last 5 years, I've been involved and immersed really in the world of cancer. I've been writing books on canine cancer, and it's been all my waking hours, really, when I've not just been doing ordinary medicine, I've been involved in studying canine cancer, and equine cancer, and feline cancer. And alongside that, every now and again, I kept tripping over autoimmune disease just by chance, because there's a huge similarity between autoimmune disease and cancer. And in fact, they're almost mirror images of themselves. So when you look at cancer, you'll often find autoimmune disease cropping up, because cancers can cause autoimmune diseases. And autoimmune diseases and cancer can be in the same individual. And that's regardless of whether that individual is a dog, a horse, a cat, a mouse, or you. So everything I'm going to say today is extremely relevant for you as individual humans, as well as your canine companions. So, there is really no division. The division is simply that we're talking at a natural dog conference. But everything I'm going to say is actually relevant to your own world as well, and that of everything else you live with. So I was studying cancer, and I wasn't particularly interested in anything else, because that was my world. And along came this patient, and I've changed the name of this patient because to protect not only the patient, but to protect the people that have worked with this dog, because this isn't about slamming people for what they don't know and me being clever, because I'm not. This is about a subject, autoimmunity, which is a little bit of a stealth bomber. And autoimmune disease is underneath so many things that are not really recognized. And one of the biggest things about autoimmune disease is that there are triggers for it, and there's always a lead up to it. Now, that lead up might be a very acute lead up. It might be that you take one drug and bang, that's tripped you over into autoimmune disease, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. But in many, many cases, there is a long, slow grind which has led the animal or the person to the disease that they end up with. And if there's a long, slow grind towards getting to where they get, that means there's an opportunity to do something about preventing it. And that's the really good news about what I'm going to talk about today, because in cancer and in autoimmune disease, if we actually wake up to what's happening, we can do something about preventing it from happening. And that's a really hard thing, because how do you prove a negative? If somebody doesn't get autoimmune disease, how can you say, well, they weren't going to get, were they going to get it anyway? They didn't get it, so what? How can you prove that? The only way you can prove it is when you do sort of stuff that I do, which is see hundreds and hundreds of animals a week, year, thousands over a lifetime as working as a vet. Because when you're seeing group dynamics of thousands, then you suddenly go, hang on a minute, I'm seeing way too much of this disease. And I didn't used to see this disease pattern. Why am I seeing loads of it now? And it's only we're going to understand about prevention when we start to see less and less of it. So for the sake of today, let's call this dog Bertie. This is Bertie with his dad, not his real dad, obviously, and a companion. And that companion wasn't a nasty dog. It was the muzzle was on for other reasons. But this was Bertie when he was 4, living a perfectly nice life. And he came and saw me, and I've put everything on slides so that for those of you there are some vets in the audience I know, and vet nurses, and there's all sorts of different backgrounds of people in this audience. So there might be things on there that you just think, what on earth she put that on there for? But it's just so that it's there if you are interested and understand it. But don't worry about the little specific things if you're not. But this dog presented to me in July of 2014, and this is not a success story. This dog was not a success. The dog was in a very, very bad way when the dog came to see me, and subsequently, sadly, after a few short weeks in my care, he died. But Bertie woke me up. So he presented in July 2014 with this thing called IMTP, which one thing you will learn about autoimmune disease is the names are atrocious. They are absolute mouthfuls, nearly all of them. So this is immune-mediated thrombocytopenia, for what it's worth. I want you all to remember that for the test. You don't have to worry about that. But what that is, those are the little tiny sticky bits. They come from the cells that make them, and they're called the platelets, and they plug up where you've got breaches in blood vessels. So they stop you bleeding out, basically. They form little blood clots. And what happens in this disease is that the cells that make those little platelets are destroyed by the body's own immune system. And so you can't make blood clots, you can't make those little packets of platelets stick into holes, and you start to bleed. So even brushing your hand across that edge would be enough to cause a bleed. That disease had gone on in Bertie to become immune-mediated hemolytic anemia, which is a second disease, and that's where Bertie's immune system said, it's not enough just to destroy all your platelet-making cells, I'm now going to destroy all your red blood cells as well. And all you need to do is really look at the numbers. You don't have to know what's normal. The normals are in brackets. You should have a platelet count of between 200 and 500, and there are some units there, but we won't worry about that. But just look at the number that Bertie came with was 33, and he had a red cell count of just 3.61, which was dropped right out from normal, and Bertie's blood was like dishwater. These drugs, again, prednisolone and azathioprine, these are really heavy immune suppressant chemotherapeutic type drugs. And the sad thing about the treatment in the conventional world of autoimmune diseases is that you'll see these drugs over and over again for every single autoimmune disease that there is out there, because there is nothing subtle, nothing individualized at all in the treatment of autoimmune disease across the board. So virtually every named disease there is, you're going to get prednisolone, azathioprine, cyclosporin, a whole bunch of really nasty drugs that do nothing other than try to annihilate and suppress your immune system. So it's not subtle. So if you've got this immune-mediated hemolytic disease, or you've got arthritis caused by autoimmunity, or you've got pancreatitis, or you've got whatever itis it is that's autoimmune, unfortunately, conventionally, everybody's going to go, well, really, I'm going to give you a massive dose of steroids, and if that doesn't work, I'm going to give you a massive dose of azathioprine, and if that doesn't work, I'm going to give you a massive dose of the next one, because we're going to have to napalm you. So not only do you start out with your disease, your own immune system napalming you, then comes the medical and the veterinary profession, and it goes, we can do better than that. We can wipe out your entire immune system, and then you won't get killed by that. Sadly, what happens is an awful lot of you and your animals can then get killed by the drugs, because these are chemotherapy levels of drugs. So he had went into remission, this dog, prior to when he got to me, and he'd already had a whole load of this stuff. And despite everything, he went back into it. And the problem when he got to me was, as I've just said, he was getting multiple side effects from the drugs. So that's where we began with this poor little guy, Bertie. But the bit that woke me up, and the bit that stopped me reading all my textbooks about cancer and went, there's something wrong here, was this statement in the history that came with the dog. And this statement in the history that came with the dog has never left my consciousness, and I hope it never will to the day I die. Because this is the size of the problem we're facing. Vets out in the big wide world have, honestly, your dogs and cats' interests at heart. Vets don't become vets in order to kill your animals. They really don't. But there's a lot of problem out in our veterinary world and our medical world. This was the statement that woke me up. This is a puzzling case, as there's no known underlying cause for this dog's current state. And genuinely, the person that referred this dog to me genuinely believed that was right. that there was no possible known underlying cause for this dog's state. So let's have a look at what was really true about Bertie and what was also in that history of that dog when it came to see me. Right, so number one is Bertie was a golden retriever. Now, obviously, that does not mean that every single golden retriever is condemned to autoimmune disease, because it's not true. But the one thing that we do know about autoimmune diseases is there are susceptibilities, and there are breeds that are strongly predisposed to them. And one of the breeds is the golden retriever. Now, I would not have done anything just by knowing it was a golden retriever. However, when we get predisposed breeds, we have to make different decisions about what we do with vaccination, what we do with feeding, what we do with all sorts of things when we know certain breeds get certain things, or we should be making different decisions. In the first year of Bertie's life, he was diagnosed with hypersensitivity to mold and soya. So he was under a year of age, and he's already said to us, my immune system's making mistakes, and I'm a baby. So he's a golden retriever, and he made mistakes in the first year of his life with his immune system. So that should be an ear prick for us as veterinary surgeons and you as owners. He had hot spots and itches, and every time he had a vaccination, it all blew up. And he was itchy, and he had an upset. So that's telling me we have a susceptibility which is now doubled. Not only is he the right breed, but we have a dog who's showing hypersensitivity, and every time you stick an immune stimulus into him, he gets worse. He was just 2 years of age when he ruptured his cruciate. Now, footballer's disease, you go running around the field and you twist and your leg doesn't go with you and you rupture your cruciate in your knee. However, Bertie was doing very little. He was just walking along, running about slightly, not doing much that was exciting, didn't go down a rabbit hole, and bing, his cruciate ruptured. Now, when you've got a dog that's a golden retriever and he's got hypersensitivity and he ruptures his cruciate, you should be thinking, why did he do that? Why did he do that? Why was there a weakness in that dog that made that cruciate rupture in a 2-year-old dog that wasn't going ballistic, running around doing something silly? Because we know, some vets know, that, for example, cruciates that rupture for no reason whatsoever, thyroid disease is really high up there on the list of differentials. Then Bertie has non-steroidal, so anti-inflammatories, quite rightly. He'd hurt his leggy hurty, need pain relief. So he has that, and he immediately reacts to it, and he gets bleeding guts, hemorrhagic gastroenteritis. So he can't tolerate that drug, and what does he do? He bleeds. So we know already by 2 years of age that he's got sensitivity, hyperreactivity to immune stimulus, possibly got thyroid disease, and can't stand drugs easily, and bleeds when it goes wrong. He then gets irritable bowel. Now, irritable bowel is autoimmune disease, possibly number 2 here, actually, but autoimmune disease in some dogs, not in all dogs, because irritable bowel can be just a precursor to IBS can be a precursor to autoimmune disease, but by the age of 3, he gets that. He has loads of antibiotics, he's fed absolute junk food, not because the owners willingly went and got him junk food, they just didn't know any better. So MMD is meat and meat derivatives, which means you haven't got a clue what it is. And it was a high grain, open formula, so those poor people who were really the nicest, best owners I ever wished to meet. Those people, sadly, took their dog to be treated for the slightest thing, and that was probably the downfall. And they were told this was a great food because it had a pretty label, and it had a healthy dog running around on the front of the packet, and it was shiny, and their vet told them it was lovely, and they fed it in good faith, and of course it was a high-grain food, which actually probably contributed to his IBS. Then he kept getting these things called recurrent hematomas, which is where blood vessels in the ear pop. Now that can be if your dog's got an ear disease and he's scratching, or it can be that he runs and flacks his ear on something hard and a vessel pops. But the thing in the history with Bertie was that there was no underlying cause for these to happen. So what's that? What's that? That's Bertie doing yet another thing that's saying, I've got weakness here, and we also know that the recurrent hematomas can be through an autoimmune disease called vasculitis, and it's probable that that's what that was. So that's autoimmune disease number 3 already in Bertie. Then the owner said, when he was 4 years of age, the worst thing was that for no reason at all, he suddenly got nervous around noises. And Bertie was a stoical, sort of solid kind of a dog, and he never was frightened of anything. And then suddenly, any noise, we got a marked noise sensitivity that came out of nowhere. And of course for me, that is, did they test his thyroid? No, they didn't. It was just, let's give him some pills because that might make it better. So he then had a minor injury, was running around and he just hurt his leg. He was given, yet again, a non-steroidal, which is really strange considering he'd already had a hemorrhagic gastroenteritis to 1 when he was 2. He has another non-steroidal and an antibiotic, and within 48 hours, the owner said he was like walking death. And this was March 2014, when he was shoved into his final pair of autoimmune diseases that killed him, plus the drugs he was given to treat them. So that statement that had been made by the referring vet that no known cause, really puzzling, don't get where this has come from, was like a knife to me, because it was like, are you serious? Are you really, really serious that you've got no idea where this has come from? Because I can give you 12 reasons why that dog has walked forward into life-killing, life-ending autoimmune disease, and he's had 4 autoimmune diseases you haven't spotted up to now. So all that you've ended up with is the worst autoimmune disease that finally saw him off. And unfortunately, that is not an uncommon thing. This is Bertie when he was 8. Now, does he look 8 compared to the 4 you saw a couple of slides back? You know, he looks to me like a 13-year-old dog, not an 8-year-old dog. That was Bertie not very long before he passed away. And, you know, this whole talk really is in honor of him, even though I'm not using his real name, because this shouldn't happen. This shouldn't happen, and it happens far too often. And one of the biggest problems we've got is when people say things like, well, how do we know what does it look like, autoimmune disease? What does it look like? Well, it can look like anything, that's the trouble. It can look like absolutely anything, because it can be any organ in the body, any tissue in the body that gets this self-attack. So it's when your immune system is not on your side. So how common is this? You know, you're thinking, I don't know anybody who's had a dog with immune-mediated thrombocytopenia. So, you know, this isn't very common, surely. Well, we have to look at what's going on in the world of human beings as well, because when you try and find the statistics for animals, it's impossible. I've trawled and trawled and trawled, and it's virtually impossible to find the stats. So this is a human study in America, and they're in a little bit more trouble than we are, but only a little bit by looking around at the papers that are being published. So this is the National Institute of Health in the USA, and they estimate that 23.5 million Americans suffer from autoimmune disease. So not 3, 23.5 million. So this is not small. And this prevalence is rising. And these studies were based upon just 24 named diseases, and we'll see how that slews the figures in a moment. So this is just 24 named diseases, you arrive at the 23.5 million Americans. And what we also have to do is actually compare this to what we think are the big killers. we're all walking around, well, a lot of people are walking around terrified of cancer, but actually 9 million in America and the same study were suffering from cancer and only 22 million from heart disease. So this is bigger. This is bigger, and yet so many people know so little about it. And there are 150 named autoimmune diseases of human beings. 150 diseases. So this is why, I can't say to you, this is dizzy-woggy disease, and that's the only autoimmune disease. There are loads of them. And they're also, again, creepy little stealth bombery type diseases that it's really hard to identify what you're really dealing with. Hypothyroidism is enormous, is huge, and it's underneath. We're picking it up every week in the practice, hypothyroidism. These are the two you've just seen, the hemolytic anemias and the thrombocytopenias. Some pancreatitis, not all. Addison's disease, some IBSs, myasthenia, pemphigus complex, Demodex, which is a mite disease, but the whole underlying problem with that mite disease, which normally lives in balance with us, or your dog, is that there's an autoimmune response that's triggered, which is what causes the pustules in the skin and the itching. There are encephalitises, CDRM, those of you who are German Shepherd people, that like myself. Big problem, the degenerative radiculomyelopathies. I told you they were great names. We've got equine diseases up there, BSE in cattle, rodent ulcers in cats. There's so many of them. Arthritises, lupus, and that's the last one. It is symmetrical leukoid leukodystrophy. There you are. Got lots and lots of names. It's enough to trip you up. So, what is happening, as I've said, is the cells of the immune system are normally programmed to recognize self. So there's a programming goes on, and these immune cells that are going around in your circulation go, oh, that's okay, that's part of you. So I'm not going to kill you, so that's all right. And it's not only the you that you think is you, as in which has got your DNA in it, but you, I have to tell you, are not what you think you are. You have at least 10 times more cells in each one of you and each one of your dogs that belong to bacteria and other organisms that form part of the bigger you, and you actually require all of them. And your immune system also recognizes those bigger you. So those bacteria that are meant to be in your gut, the immune system does not kill. It doesn't kill the bacteria that is supposed to be on your skin and supposed to be in your mouth. It recognizes that as the bigger you, and the same with your dog. But what we do know is that this is a disease of our time, or a disease complex of our time. Environmental conditions such as toxin exposure, diet particularly, and we'll see why in a minute, stress even, stress like cancer. So many cancers are triggered by a massive stress event because that pushes the immune system into a big whirly, for the want of a better way to describing it, and it pushes the body over into expressing disease. But the one thing that's important to recognize is that autoimmune disease requires a trigger. So spontaneous combustion is not going to happen. There is something behind it, and the big Clouseau thing is to try and find what that trigger is. And many diseases in man and animals have much greater risks in certain families. So this is what I said to you earlier. It's about genetic susceptibility as well, and it's about where your weak spots are, where the weak spots in your dog are. So if your dog, for example, gets repeated gut problems, or it gets repeated sort of little achy, limpy things, then that's the weak bit. That's the bit that's more likely to get attacked in an autoimmune disease. And you can also, not all of these autoimmune diseases are permanent. You can get little temporary autoimmune reactions which the body recovers itself from. It's almost like the body recognizes that it's got some rogue behavior going on, and it straightens itself out. However, if you have an animal that's ever had a self-corrected autoimmune disease, like this dog that's up on the slides, this is a dog that when he was 1 year of age, here he is, another golden retriever. I hope it's not going to upset all the golden retriever people in the audience. But, and by the way, all sorts of breeds can get these problems. But this guy, you see that he's got that funny patch on his muzzle. That's a localized Demodex outbreak. And what that little patch is just his body going, excuse me, but if you notice what's happening to me, your vet will possibly give you some different advice, because I'm already telling you that I have a susceptibility to autoimmune disease because I've got this little spot here of Demodex, and it might go away, but I'm just giving you a warning that I've got an autoimmune susceptibility. And sure enough, within another 1.5 years of that dog's life, he had hypothyroidism. And everybody went to that owner of that dog. It went away, it's all gone. Isn't that good? He cured himself. The Demodex went. All is well in your world, treat him as normal. No. He should never have been treated as normal. He had his booster, and then within 3 months of that, he had hypothyroidism. So that when you have a dog that has a temporary self-corrected autoimmune disease, that's when your ears should be even more pricked up to say, I have to treat this dog a little differently. Loads and loads and loads of questions, and all the things I've put on these slides are taken from evidence-based, because certainly in the veterinary world at the moment and the medical world, we are really being pushed that everything that we ever present to anybody has to have an evidence base behind it. So the things that I'm putting on here are from papers and some of the arguments that are going on in the world at the moment. So the questions that are being asked in the bigger, wider world about autoimmune disease and why it's happening is that there are changes in protein markers on genes. There's alterations in these things called T cells, which are part of your immune system, and how the T cells change and how they recognize markers on cells. And this is, again, where there's this huge crossover between autoimmune disease and cancer, because T cells are always involved in what's happening in animals and people with cancer. So T cells are the naughty guys in an awful lot of diseases. Are genes corrupted or just switched on and off? Now in cancers you can have complete gene mutations, and you can with this type of disease, but actually a lot of the time the genes are actually just switched on or off the wrong way. And you know, Jean Dodds, who you're going to listen to tomorrow morning, who is the queen of this, and really listen to what she has to say, because she's done such an enormous amount of work on this very whole subject of genes switching back on and switching back off, depending on which way is right. And then there's all sorts of other hypotheses of, is it proteins that are changing in cells? Is it disruptions of interactions between cells that are responsible for these reactions? For today, we don't have to worry too much about that, but it's just to show you that this is a world in its infancy, because these diseases are recognized, but they're really not understood very well yet at all. And as I said earlier, the actual treatment of them is pretty arcane, because if we're still using sledgehammers to crack nuts, it's a shame, isn't it, in 2015, but we are. These are just some of my patients who've got autoimmune diseases. You can see both of these guys, and the collie at the top, the rough collie at the top, that's a typical breed susceptibility to some of the leukoid problems that you see in the nose. And that's another one, little one underneath. She's got an autoimmune disease that affects the junction between the skin and the nose tissue. So these are the triggers, and really pay attention to these, because unfortunately they cover virtually every interaction you'll ever do with a dog. But these are triggers, and these are things that you've got to really think about. Stress. Now, what is stress for a dog? Stress for a dog can be the loss of a companion dog. It can be a household that's fighting. It can be going on holiday. It can be all sorts of things. Hormones. We'll look at each of these in a little bit more depth in a minute. Infections. So if your dog has an infection or you have an infection of any type, then you just need to pay attention, because that is a little bit of a vulnerable time if you happen to be a susceptible individual. Vaccines, big one, and Jean, as I say, is going to talk about that a lot tomorrow morning. Drugs. Every time you have to use drugs, and I am certainly not telling you that you must never use a drug in your life, but every time you do put a drug in your dog or you put a drug in yourself, there is potentially more possible, more outcomes that could happen than the one you think you're going to actually achieve. Food, really important. But even things like UV radiation can trigger autoimmune diseases in some animals, such as that nose on the bottom there was triggered by sunlight. So let's have a look at stress. The little dog there is the little dog called Widget. That is Widget's real name. And Widget was an immune-mediated hemolytic anemia case. And Widget's original trigger was mum and dad went on holiday and little Widge went to the neighbours, which was enough stress to tip her over the top. And it's like, oh my God, am I ever going to go on holiday ever again? Yes, you can, but just if you know your dog's got certain things happening, then you need to think a little bit carefully about how you manage the stress of putting your dog into a kennel, or of moving house, or of when another dog dies, or a divorce happens in the family, or somebody screaming at someone else because there's conflict in the family and the dog's going, I can't handle this. These are the things that you've got to be thinking about. And in human medicine, and this is exactly the same for cancer, you can read these two things almost in the same sentence. Retrospective studies have found in humans that up to 80% of patients reported an uncommon emotional stress before the disease started. Now, I would actually say that in practice, because I treat humans too, with homeopathy, that actually when you look at cancer and autoimmune disease, you can see a stress in nearly all of the cases. You can find a stress event. Now, you may not be able to stop stress events happening. I'd love to be able to, wouldn't you? I mean, we can't stop stress events happening, but we do have to prick our ears up to them and maybe help those individuals that aren't actually adapting to stress very well before this sort of thing happens. And you can get into a vicious cycle of stress. And of course, why does stress cause the problem? It causes it because of the hormone system, the adrenal gland, and neurochemistry. So it's the chemicals that our immune system and our adrenal glands and our pituitary glands pump into our system, the very same ones actually that Isla was talking about, that can actually push you over and trigger an autoimmune response. And so one thing we have to remember with any animal that has an autoimmune disease is that stress management has to be part of the overall management of that case. It's no good just thinking about the drugs we have to do. We have to manage that dog's life. We have to manage its environment. We have to manage the changes that happen, because we will have to have change in life. It's natural, it's called living. But we have to manage it a little bit better for those animals that have autoimmune disease. Hormones are underneath loads of things. But again, this is one of the few areas where spaying a bitch, for example, would be something I might advocate if there is a really strong autoimmune tendency, where I might not in an animal that does not have this tendency. Because every time some bitches come into season, if they are really susceptible to autoimmune disease or already have one, it's going to be a flashpoint for that autoimmune disease to get worse. So hormones can radically, we don't need to go into the wheres and the wherefores here this morning, but hormones can alter what happens in autoimmune disease. And the hormone system is a very basic system. And every single hormone in the body affects every other hormone in the body. It's a kind of a very, very complex feedback-regulated system. So one hormone goes up, another one will come down, which might trigger another one to wake up, and so on and so forth. So if you have a massive rise in cortisol, for example, you will have things happening in the rest of the hormone system. And depending on what the triggers are in the individual dog, that can be enough to just tip it over into an autoimmune expression. And then there's some really bizarre things, but I'm going to mention them because you'll just hear little offshoots about them all over the place, and more is going to happen on autoimmune disease as the years go on. But there are also some theories about infections that we actually at this point know nothing about. There's a little paper underneath there that's probably too small for you to read, but it's not relevant. That's a little study on nanobacteria and its implication with Alzheimer's disease, because when they look in these little plaques that they're finding in the brains of Alzheimer's patients, they're finding these nanobacteria. And so one of the things that is being questioned is, could it possibly be that we've got infections that we really don't understand at all that are underneath a lot of these problems? And who knows? But there's some evidence for it. We also know that there's these little organisms called mycoplasmas. Any of you that are cat people here or horse people that will possibly have already heard about mycoplasmal disease, certainly of the upper respiratory tract. But mycoplasmas have also been implicated. And so it's actually postulated that they may be triggered because they can be passive, they can sit in your system and get hidden, like most autoimmune disease is hidden. They can sit in your system, but when your immune system is under pressure, that's when they play their games. So they're chameleon-like. And one of the reasons that this theory is coming about is through cell cultures. If you work in the cell culture industry and you're growing up cell lines, you suddenly realize that however sterile you are, there are pathogens that can affect your cell lines. And they've now realized that it's mycoplasmas, and that's teeny, that little tiny insert that's there. But when you actually look at what mycoplasmas do, they do just about everything that happens in either cancer or autoimmune responses in cells. And they can change DNA, they can switch DNA on and off, they can inhibit cell growth, and they can destroy cells. So that's kind of interesting, and that's where that theories come from. But even more relevant to us and day-to-day management of our dogs are autoimmunity and viruses. We know that immune suppressant viruses like the retroviruses and parvoviruses have been implicated in immune dysfunction. And so these are known. So everything, as I say, on these is a known thing. This isn't a wah-wah wacky Sue saying this. These are known things. We also know that viral disease and vaccination with single or combined modified live viruses can trigger immune-mediated blood disease. Again, a susceptible individual is needed, but nevertheless, they can trigger it. They can trigger bone marrow failure. They can trigger organ dysfunction. We know that killed rabies vaccine and lepto vaccine can trigger immediate or delayed vaccinosis reactions. So these again are known. This is again not saying every dog given a vaccine will have something like this. It's a small percentage. But if the small percentage happens to be your dog, that matters. It really does matter. And you know, we're lucky in this country. We at the moment are not having to vaccinate every dog that moves with rabies. And thank goodness we're not, because I work a lot in the United States and I work a lot in other countries where rabies vaccine is a given. You have to do it. And this is what and you see totally different disease spectrum, and totally different autoimmune levels. And this may be one of the reasons why. It may be so many other things. It might be environmental factors, it might be food factors, but it could also be that the rabies vaccine is going in these animals. And we've got diseases in this country, unfortunately, like Lyme's disease, which is a little bit on the up at the moment, which is a real naughty for triggering autoimmune disease. So Lyme's is a nasty. And that's a tick-borne disease. And certainly in other countries of the world, the tick-borne diseases are really ramping up autoimmune expression. So when you're thinking about getting your dog pet passported and you're thinking, oh, it'd be really nice for my dog to go on a holiday to Spain, think again. please, please think again. If you live half a year in Spain, or I'm not knocking Spain, by the way, but if you live half a year in Spain, it might be a bit different. But if you're thinking about dragging your dog in a hot, steamy car on a ferry to a hot country and whacking it full of wormers and rabies vaccine and distemper vaccine and parvo vaccine, please don't do it. It's far less stressful for a dog to be with a house sitter or to even be possibly in a kennel than it is to be dragged around a foreign country and pumped full of medication and vaccination, all of which could be autoimmune triggers for your dog. I just will not give pet passports personally. That's a personal thing. I know some people have to do it for breeding purposes, and I know that dogs are imported and exported, and that's, again, that's a different thing. There are times in life where you have to do things, but there are other things you can do to mitigate the side effects as well. But that's another 4-day lecture. Vaccination. Other things to just think about with vaccination is that not only are you vaccinating and sticking the virus under the skin, you're also putting in host identical and host similar tissue, and that can actually make the immune system get confused and go, are you foreign or are you you? And depending on what you are, should I be killing you or shouldn't I? And of course, if the immune system at that point decides it should be killing you, then it's not only going to kill host identical tissue, it's going to start killing you at the same speed. We know that we can get hypersensitivity reactions to vaccination, and we know that things like parvo, rabies, and distemper, which we've already mentioned, can be immunosuppressant and create autoimmunity. This is a good one, isn't it? Self-organized criticality theory. Let's simplify it. This is a bit scary, though, because, not scary because there's lots of long words, it's scary because what we also now know, and that little tiddly thing up the top is the paper that this comes from, is that if you keep sticking antigenic material, i.e. a vaccine, under the skin of an individual repeatedly, that over time the immune system keeps checking in and checking in and checking in, and eventually it starts what's called revising itself. So it revises its opinion about what's you and what's not you, regardless of what it is. So it's not that you put in Aziwongi's lepto vaccine every year, and so it's a repeat of Aziwongi's lepto, and there isn't one, by the way. It's not that you have to put in the same thing year after year after year. It's that if you put any old antigenic stimulus but repeatedly under the skin, the immune system starts revising and you get cross-reactivity, and then bang, it can push it over. So it can be vaccines against different things, but because of the repeated insult on the immune system, it can fall over. And again, this is in a percentage of dogs, not in every dog by any stretch of the imagination, but in a percentage they fall over. This was a big, huge study done at the University of, in Purdue University, veterinary medicine, in 1999. This has caused a furore because obviously the vaccine industry doesn't like it and a lot of vets don't like it, but it's real. It was a big study on dogs. And the other thing they found, which is very relevant to what happens in the gut, is that vaccinated dogs create autoantibodies to all these lovely little words, and things like fibronectin, laminin, albumin, blah, 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 blah. Collagen you'll all recognize. Collagen's kind of the thing that holds you together. Little bit relevant. You would all be just a big mush if it wasn't for collagen. Collagen is fibrous connective tissue. You know, it really is the stuff that holds you together. So if you're developing autoantibodies to the bit that holds you together, that's a little bit worrying. And also autoantibodies to DNA. That is the bit that is you. So if it's actually attacking DNA as well, that's also not good news. And laminin is a little chemical, if you like, that's involved in cell adhesion, so sticking cells together, because again, if your cells can't connect to each other and form junctions, you kind of fall apart. It's not very good. You get leaky. Things leak out, things leak in, where they shouldn't. And so we know that vaccinated dogs, regardless of what the vaccine was, can develop autoimmune autoantibodies to these really critical, essential proteins. Cardiolipin is another one that forms blood clots. So when it comes to the vaccines, we also have published that the autoimmune hemolytic anemia can be tripped into with that. That's stated in the Merck manual. Some of you will know that. And in the Merck manual, which used to be the Bible, I mean, there's so many Bibles now, but the Merck manual used to be the Bible for vets. That also states that if you've got an immunodeficiency in B or T cells, that you shouldn't receive live vaccines. But, you know, these are the sorts of things that often when you go in and you've got a 10-minute appointment to have a booster, people are not being asked these questions. They're not being asked the questions. You know, did your dog ever have a problem before? Does your dog have immunodeficiency problems in other areas? Does your dog have IBS? Does your dog have arthritis? Does your dog have pancreatitis? Because really, these are the questions that need to be asked every single time a dog has a booster, and not just assumed that the dog is healthy. And again, there are known published disease associations with vaccination in humans, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but just so that you can see that the associations that are published already to the human vaccines, we know that there are things like lupus with tetanus vaccine, the HPV, the hepatitis B vaccine, the anthrax vaccine, which most of you won't encounter, but little things like the flu vaccine, polyarteritis nodosa is there. This thing called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is where you get progressive muscle weakness, and in some patients it's so bad that they can't swallow, they lose bladder control, they can't walk, they get pain. These aren't cute diseases. These are very, very unpleasant diseases. And the one thing about autoimmune diseases is they can express in very mild forms, so patients just go, ooh, you know, I had my flu vac, but I'm just a bit achy. And that's it, right through the spectrum of shades of grey to black, where the patient can hardly move or swallow or go to the loo. So, you know, and this is serious stuff, and that's just the ones that are published. There are hypotheses out there that say that half of our problem in the modern world is because we're not dying of what we should die of. We're no longer dying of the acute nasty diseases that sweep through and actually make our immune system flex its muscles, so to speak, to use an analogy. But our immune system is now kind of not doing what it should be doing as an animal meeting diseases that come in the epidemic way that they used to, like measles, mumps, and rubella, all of those things that we used to actually get our immune system to flex with, or in our dogs' cases, parvo and distemper and all those things that do kill dogs. I mean, they kill dogs, so it's this horrible juxtaposition, isn't it? What do we want? Do we want dogs that are going to die of parvo, or do we want dogs that are vaccinated and they're going to die of autoimmune disease? What do we do? What do we do? Because it's only a small percentage that will ever get the autoimmune disease. So most of them will be beautifully vaccinated and beautifully immune. But some of them, they won't. And it's this horrible juxtaposition. And they're saying that one of the hypotheses is that because we're getting cleaner and cleaner and cleaner and we're mopping everything up and we're stopping the immune system from doing what it's supposed to do, that it falls over and makes massive mistakes and actually starts killing us. And the same thing is, you know, this sort of napalm every food surface that you use, wash your hands with absolutely everything, stay upright, put a zip over your child's mouth and your puppy's mouth, don't let it eat anything, everything steam cleaned. What's the immune system doing? It's not actually building up a bank of, I know what that is, and I'll get rid of it for you. And what we're doing is we're then making this individual so vulnerable that it actually can't go out into the world without getting sick. And we're thinking we're doing it a favor. And they've proved that with this mouse model where they took genetically identical mice, and so they knew that they had absolutely identical antibodies, and they put one lot, they allowed them just to be mice in an ordinary environment, and they put one lot in a sterile environment, and it was absolutely so clear that when they actually did the final readings on these animals, that the lab animals in the sterile environment couldn't fight off parasites when they were challenged, they couldn't fight off any diseases very easily, and they developed allergies and autoimmune disease. And the ones that had the dirty, mucky, normal environment had way less disease, way less allergy, way less autoimmune disease, and way better ability to fight off parasites. And of course, there's loads of pieces of published information now that's out there about if you take your puppies into the wood when they're young, they'll get some of the fungal elements, they'll get some of the soil bacteria, and that those are actually helping the immune system to develop its strength. But if you keep your puppy in this lovely napalmed, cleaned, superly sterile environment, you're actually doing it no favours whatsoever. No favours at all. Or your children. Gut, the microbiota, as it's now being used, the word is all over everywhere that you read. The microbiota is the current word for all of those organisms in your inner pipe and your dog's inner pipe that are there on your behalf. And we know that the gut is the biggest immune system in the part of the immune organ in the body. And about 70% of the body's immune function, actually, sorry, that's grammatically incorrect. It should be a Y with an apostrophe S. That was me getting carried away, too late. Immune function is found in the intestinal lining. So 70% of the immune system is actually centered in the gut. So that, again, should tell us something, that food really should be a little bit more important than a lot of people think it is. We haven't got time to go into all of the things about stomach acid, etc. But what I want you to take away is that what you put into your animals, their meat in terms of food, is vitally important. Because this is, if you inflame the gut with the wrong food and the wrong food substances, you get this leaky gut syndrome, and you allow foreign material to get into the bloodstream and evade the immune system, and that can push the immune system to have too much stimulation until you trigger it to fall over into autoimmune disease. Or, you know, it starts off with the irritable bowel, the colitises of this world, the dog that can only eat certain foods, but they're often triggered by the fact that the wrong food has been given in the first place. And it's then made that gut, those junctions between the cells, leaky, and the whole system starts to become hyperreactive. And we get all of these food sensitivities. You know, Isla alluded to this and talked about it in her talk, that, you know, we're now living in the world of my dog is sensitive to this, or my child is sensitive to that. This whole thing around food sensitivity, we've kind of done it to our animals and to ourselves. So you get, the biggest common one in man is, of course, the gluten allergy, which everybody's walking around thinking they've got. Alongside their candida that everybody else has got. And, you know, there are some people that do have candidiasis and do have genuine gluten sensitivity. And, of course, the worst form in man is celiac disease. And that really is a very serious thing, because it doesn't only just affect the gut, because the gut's just the gateway. Your dog or you or your mouse, you are, the skin and the gut are the same thing. It's just a tube. The real you is in the swishy bits either side of that tube that runs down the middle. The gut is the outside still. It's not inside you, it's outside, because it's outside of your body. But it is the gateway in to your body. And if things go wrong at that level, it spills out, and the immune system then can go wrong all over your body, not just your gut. And anybody in the room who's got psoriasis knows that psoriasis can affect joints, it can affect other things. You know, there's loads and loads of connection. And then drugs. Published are that some of the combinations of heartworm preventatives in the USA, for example, are known to be autoimmune triggers. But simple drugs like some of the anticonvulsants, the potentiated sulfonamides, they're known and published to trigger autoimmune disease. But here's the really, really bad bit of news, and it is a bad bit of news. Any drug can have the potential to trigger an autoimmune disease in a susceptible individual. Any drug. any drug at all. So it might be that you take a paracetamol and that might be enough. With a stress and the wrong food on the wrong day, boom, you fall over, or your dog falls over, or your mouse falls over, or your horse falls over. And of course, drugs also can actually exacerbate an already existing autoimmune disease. And that's kind of what happened with Bertie, isn't it? But we're at the Natural Dog Conference. Be careful. Be careful about what you go. Natural's good. You know, drugs are bad. Natural's great. Drink a bottle of echinacea, everything's great. No, it isn't. Herbs are medicines. They're nature's medicines. I adore herbal medicine. You know, I'm a great proponent of it. But just don't get carried away that anything that's got the label natural means it is safe. We know that this is 2 humans, and you're going to go, oh, really, Sue, get real. But, you know, this is because I can only put up published material. But echinacea, for example, and spirulina has triggered autoimmune disease. It's about the susceptibility of the individual. So you've got to watch. And I don't think health is not walking around with you or your dog full of supplements. You know, being healthy means you eat food, you breathe air, you sleep, you have sex if you're lucky, and life is good. Health is not that you have to survive. You can only survive if you're taking 48 pills. You know, so again, I get lots of patients coming in saying, you know, I'm on vitamin C, I'm taking echinacea every day, and I'm taking vitamin D, and I'm taking antioxidants, and I'm taking fish oil, and I'm taking this. I said, have you got time to eat? You know, have you ever thought about just eating a healthy diet? Because that could really be a good idea. Try not to take things all the time, because if you're taking something that is every single day of your life or your dog's life, you could actually be doing a misfavor. Because again, you're saying to that dog's immune system, look, I'm going to give you this forever, so you can just go off duty. You know, don't worry. I'll give you all the vitamin C and the antioxidants. You don't have to work. And the dog's immune system goes, all right then, if you're going to do it for me, why would I bother? You've got to allow the dog's system to work as it's designed to work. And actually, nature was very clever. Evolution has done some amazing things if we don't stymie it every time. Then we know that autoimmune disease has known associations. We won't need to sort of labour on these. We know, for example, that herpes virus in the human is associated with multiple sclerosis. We know that bacteria are associated with rheumatoid arthritis, and we've already said that Lyme's disease is one of those that can trigger an autoimmune arthritic change. And Clostridia with ankylosing spondylitis. There's a lot of evidence around that. And then we've got this little thing called molecular mimicry, and this is where I said right at the beginning, please don't ever ignore an infection or something that's happened to your dog. Just make a note of it. Even if you make a note of it and you store it away forever, I can't tell you the number of times as a vet and a homeopath that somebody will say something as they're about to walk out the door, and it's the most important thing they've said. And it'll be, oh, by the way, I don't suppose it mattered, did it, that, you know, he actually fell in a river the other day and you know, cut his throat and, and did all these things. It's like, what do you mean it didn't matter? Of course it matters. That's probably what's caused whatever it is that we're treating today. So everything matters, and this is a case. I'm just going to end the talk really with this little case. But molecular mimicry is another really, really important one, and it ties up all these theories that say that viruses and nanobacteria and mycobacteria and other bacteria and viruses can cause autoimmune disease. Because it's the idea that a foreign substance mimics, because nature is incredibly clever, that we know that bacteria can mimic a body component, because what it's trying to do is get in and cause damage without your immune system knowing it's there, or your dog's immune system knowing it's there. So what some of the bacteria have done, and things like E. coli can do this, they will mimic markers on your cells. And that's really mean, isn't it? Because what that means is that your immune system gets terribly confused. Gets very, very confused, and and so then your immune system can be triggered into making serious mistakes and literally start bombing you because it thinks you are the bacteria. And this happens quite a lot. And there's models, for example, in rabbits that are known, and again, this Guillain-Barré syndrome is another one case in point with Campylobacter. That bacteria, the Campylobacter that can come through in food, can trigger Guillain-Barré syndrome in humans, but also in dogs. I know personally some people that have had dogs where the dogs have appeared to go paralysed for no reason at all, and it's entirely possible that Campylobacter was underneath that. And Lyme's disease can do the same thing. So just to end, here's a little case of a dog that I've recently been treating. It's hard to see because she's a black dog. So black dogs mean that it's like, well, what does that look like? It looks like nothing at all. But this is a case of triple M, masticatory muscle myositis. And this is the muscles that I was talking about that the dogs used for crushing bone and crushing meat. These wonderful temporal muscles and masseter muscles on the side of the face that, by the way, when you look at the difference between the heads of raw food fed dogs and the heads of those that are fed kibble, look at the muscle differences of dogs that are eating proper food versus not having to use your head. They're quite different. But this dog was eating, well, eventually was eating a good diet, but that was not the reason why her head muscles had disappeared. And she's got two big slabby holes and just bone on the side of her head. So she's a Portuguese water dog. She's at that stage she was entire. And in November last year, she developed jaw pain. And guess what? She was treated with steroids. There's a surprise, because that's the only thing that the conventional world knows how to use. But again, totally not picked up. This bitch, when she was young, had repeated bouts of cystitis and treated with loads and loads of antibiotics, as you do. And in the May of this year, she was lethargic, she got pain in the jaw, she wanted ice cubes, she was desperate for ice to take the pain away, treated with loads of steroids, ended up with a non-regenerative anemia. What that means is her bone marrow went, that's it, I'm not doing anything. You forget it, I'm not making any more blood for you because you've just napalmed me with steroids. And so the bone marrow quit. And so this is the story of my life and some of the other people in this room that work with homeopathy. That's when you get the case. Yeah. Hey, Sue, have this one. Because we can't do anything with it. So she comes along to me, and obviously she can't keep going on those steroids because they're killing her. So she comes in June. And of course, when you start asking the questions, what was going on just before this happened? What was going on? Oh, nothing. Nothing. She had another bout of cystitis, but, that's not relevant. Well, what do you mean it's not relevant? Of course it's relevant, because that's what caused it. Totally relevant. Because we know that the bacteria that she had, which was an E. coli cystitis, E. coli is incredibly capable of doing this molecular mimicry, and the markers in the muscles on the head are quite unique. They're very different, which is why this set of muscles gets hit in the dog when the rest of the muscles of the dog stay fine. And so these 2M antibodies were formed in this dog, which had exactly the same. So the poor old immune system had created these antibodies to try and kill the bacteria in the cystitis, but at the same time was napalming the dog's head because the immune system couldn't tell the difference because of molecular mimicry. So just to give you a little tiny bit of hope, that obviously I don't napalm all the dogs with steroids and azathioprine because I'm a homeopath as well as a vet. And we treated her. What was very, very interesting is the dog also wasn't treated for the fact that she had no red blood cells, which was a bit of a shame. Because you don't feel really very well when you haven't got any blood. You just feel a bit poorly. So she was treated, but the most important thing about this, she was treated homeopathically because there are no other drugs other than steroids, to be fair to the rest of the veterinary profession. There is nothing else on the shelf. You know, what do you do? If you've got a dog with an autoimmune disease, what do? Because your only tools are immune suppressants. But thankfully, if you are a nutcase like me and you do homeopathy, there are many, 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 many tools. Many tools. I mean, we have over 4,000 remedies to choose from. So, you know, a lot of tools. So this dog was treated and she was given iron in a nice safe form that she could actually utilise, because most pills of iron you can't utilise at all. They go out as fast as they came in. Her urinary tract was nurtured, and she was a bitch, again, that was still intact, and the decision was made to spay her, because every time she comes into season, this was also likely to make her very, very vulnerable to another attack. And the good news is that's her now. And the weird thing, well, this is only a recent case, as you might say, well, see, you've only got 6 months follow-up, so that's rubbish. But this is her, and I think even she's got her head down because she's mucking about because she doesn't like photographs. But what is extraordinary with this dog, which is very, very odd, is that mostly when these muscles are destroyed, they don't come back. And hers came back, and nobody can understand why, including me. But you can do other things with these cases. You do not have to napalm all of them, so there is hope. I've treated literally hundreds and hundreds of autoimmune diseases, and serious ones. You know, Bertie didn't make it because Bertie arrived in my hands nearly dead. But there are things, even as bad as Bertie. Little Widget had immune-mediated hemolytic anemia and survived. Is doing great. She's absolutely fine. And I know there's others in this room that treat them and will also contest, say that they know that they can treat autoimmune disease. Does not mean a death knell. But unfortunately, if you do go and get caught with the immunosuppression, some of them can be saved without doubt, but then you've got to deal with the fallout of the drugs that you've given. But my message today is really just to say to you, become informed, because unfortunately, a lot of the medical and veterinary professions are not as informed as they should be. Know your breed, know your dog's ancestors, get to know the weak spots in your dog, make really sensible decisions about vaccination. And by that I mean, whatever you do, don't just keep slamming them in, year out, without thinking. There are titer tests available where you can actually find if your dog has the antibodies that mean that you know if your dog is protected. They're not the be-all and end-all, but they are a heck of a lot better than just putting a vaccination in without knowing. Chemical decisions. Now, be careful about just slapping wormers and flea treatments on dogs month in, month out. Neutering decisions, stress management, treatment options in sickness. You know, does your dog really need to go for a course of antibiotics, or could you just lightening the diet off for a couple of days solve the diarrhea? Does your dog really need to have non-steroidal anti-inflammatories pumped in because it's got a bit of a limp? Or is there something better that you could do for a few days, like a little bit of turmeric that might see it through? You know, make sensible decisions, and not just for your dog. If you've got a stress headache and you need your ibuprofen and your paracetamol, think about it. Do you really, or do you actually need a glass of water? You know, just try to limit the number of drugs you and your animals are having, and never ignore a reaction that your dog has to an intervention. It doesn't mean your dog will have an autoimmune disease next week, but if your dog has had a reaction, at least don't do the same thing ever again, and make sure your vet never does the same thing ever again. And also just be a little bit aware in your head, okay, I might have to be a bit more careful about the decisions I make about the vaccine, for example. So it's just being really mindful and educating yourselves so that you make good decisions for your dogs and yourself. Okay, thank you.